Our guest speaker for the night tonight, it is Senator Tom Cotton. He is a United States Senator from Arkansas. His committees include the Senate Judiciary Committee, where he serves as the ranking member for the Subcommittee on Criminal Justice and Counterterrorism, the Intelligence Committee, and the Armed Services Committee, where he serves as the ranking member of the Air Land Power Subcommittee. He grew up on his family's cattle farm in Yell County. He graduated from Darrendale High School, Harvard, and Harvard Law School. After a clerkship with the U.S. Court of Appeals and private law practice, he left the law because of the September 11th attacks. He served nearly 5 years on active duty in the United States Army as an infantry officer. He served in Iraq with the 101st Airborne and in Afghanistan with a provincial reconstruction team. Between his two combat tours, he served with the Old Guard at the Arlington National Cemetery. His military decorations include the Bronze Star Medal, Combat Infantry Badge, and Ranger Tab. Between the Army and the Senate, Tom has worked for McKinsey & Company and served one term in the House of Representatives. Tom and his wife, Anna, have two sons, Gabriel and Daniel. And it is an honor to welcome you onto our call tonight, Senator. And I look forward to hearing some of the words that you have to share with us. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks very much, Amber, for the kind introduction, and thanks for helping to run the show here tonight. I appreciate you very much. I also want to acknowledge my fellow Arkansan, Julie Harris, the president of the National Federation for Republican Women, and also understand that another fellow Arkansan, Nikki Beaver, has recently become the political director. So that's great. We're very glad to have our Arkansans represented so well, because I know that the Arkansas Federation of Republican Women are the backbone of my campaigns and really any campaign in the state, as I suspect they are in all of your states as well. So when Julie asked if I could come speak to your virtual organization tonight, I said I'd be glad to. I want to leave most of the time for questions tonight, but I did want to just address a couple of things that are in the news. The tragic deaths of 3 American soldiers. We now know 3 National Guardsmen from Georgia in the Middle East over the weekend because of Iran-backed terrorists. And also the chaos, the crisis we see at our southern border. Last month, having over 300,000 illegal migrants crossing our border, which in a year would be larger than the state's population of Arkansas. Quite a bit larger, several multiples of the population of South Dakota, I guess. The reason I want to touch on those 2 items, not just because they're in the news and they're important, but they get back to the same fundamental problem, which is President Biden and his weakness and his unwillingness to perform the central responsibilities of the office of the presidency. Let's start with the Middle East. The atrocity against Israel on October 7th was the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. Israel is rightly trying at this very hour to destroy Hamas entirely in Gaza. But the attacks on our troops did not begin on October 7th. They didn't begin because we back Israel. They've been going on not just for 3 years under Joe Biden, but for 45 years, ever since the Ayatollah seized power and began a campaign of terror against America and against the civilized world. Now, there are times when that campaign of terror has receded, such as in 1988, when Ronald Reagan sunk half the Iranian Navy in response to its mining the Persian Gulf and hitting a U.S. Navy ship, or in 2020, when Donald Trump ordered the killing of Qasem Soleimani, Iran's terrorist mastermind, and Iran pulled in its horns. But since the very first day of this administration, Joe Biden, as Democrats always do, has been signaling weakness and irresolution to the Ayatollahs. And that's why even before the October 7th atrocity in Israel, you had almost 100 instances in Joe Biden's first 3 years in office of Iran or its proxies attacking American positions or American citizens throughout the region. After almost 100 attacks, how many times have we responded? 4. That's why Iran thought it could get away with over 150 more attacks over the last 3 months, because Biden has consistently shown that he will not protect America's interests or even Americans themselves in the Middle East. We get attacks from Iraq and from Syria and from Yemen and from Lebanon. All of these things are because Joe Biden has projected weakness. And he constantly talks about not wanting to escalate the war, not wanting to be disproportionate. That in itself is escalating this crisis because it's encouraging the Ayatollahs and all of their terrorist forces to actually take more shots at Americans. And as I've sadly predicted now for 4 months, this is what it would lead to, the deaths of Americans. We have excellent air defense systems. Our troops are very skilled, but it only takes one missile or rocket or attack drone to get through to see what happened over this weekend. And until America once again scares the Ayatollahs straight or kills their terrorist masterminds dead, Americans will still be at risk throughout the Middle East. Again, this is all Joe Biden's doing. One of the last things Donald Trump did as he was leaving office was to threaten the Ayatollahs with massive retaliation if there was a single American harmed. I think he tweeted it and called it health advice for the Ayatollahs, and they got the picture. But they also got the picture of Joe Biden, that Uncle Sam has a kick me sign on her back. And frankly, Joe Biden makes Jimmy Carter look like Ronald Reagan. The second issue, which is again related, is our southern border. And it's not just related because our southern border is also a grave national security crisis. We just learned over the weekend that the Biden administration let in a Somali terrorist into America and only detained him in the last few days, a year later, because he was arrested in Minnesota on unrelated charges. But again, it gets back to President Biden's projecting weakness to the world. That one of the very first things Joe Biden did when he took office was to reverse Donald Trump's immigration policies, which had in effect closed our border even before the COVID shutdowns. And when you broadcast to the world that if you make the journey, you can get in, you get more migrants making the journey. So no longer is it a case that we have young Mexican men trying to sneak across our border to get jobs. There may be some of that still, but that's not the core of the problem. Or Central Americans trying to sneak across our border to get jobs. You have migrants from literally every country in the world, I believe, at this point, who are flying to Mexico, coming from places as far away as Ghana in Africa, or Romania in Europe, or Nepal in Asia, and then making the journey, usually with the assistance of human traffickers or even drug cartels, because they know they can get in. I referenced Ghana, a small West African nation. Typically, African illegal migrants have gone to Europe because it's so much closer. Get to the northern shore of Africa, get on a boat, get to Sicily, get to Malta, get to Italy, and you'd be admitted. I read a quote recently from a Ghanaian man who had recently entered America as a migrant claiming asylum. And he said explicitly, we came to America instead of Europe because it's easier to get in America. Now, we could stop that flow of migrants today. It wouldn't take much. It wouldn't take some big new bill. It wouldn't take billions of dollars in new Border Patrol agents or immigration judges. Frankly, it wouldn't even take spending money on a wall. All it would take is turning them around and telling them they don't get in. They have to wait in Mexico, just as happened under the Trump administration, because the first thing these migrants do once they get to our border and crossing the country is they get on their phones and they send back text messages or direct messages to all of their friends and family in the home country saying, I got in, you can too. As soon as the message starts going back to Ghana and Romania and Nepal and every other country around the world saying, hey, I didn't get in, I'm stuck in Mexico for the next 3 years before I have a hearing, guess what? No more people are coming to our border. And then what limited illegal immigration remains can be addressed by things like building the wall that Donald Trump started, getting more border patrol, having more immigration judges. But again, it's President Biden projecting weakness and irresolution to the world that has caused this crisis at the border, just like it's caused the deaths of Americans in the Middle East. I don't think we're going to get Joe Biden being any tougher, stronger, or more resolute over the next year. So that's why we need to make sure that we turn Joe Biden out of the White House this November. And I know all of you are going to be at the heart of that effort. And for that, I thank you very much. Amber, let me turn it back to you. And now I'm happy to take your questions.
Absolutely. And if anyone has any questions, I'll be checking my email. And if you want to use the chat feature, I can have Lori kind of flag if we get any questions in the chat as we're talking here. But I did have some questions submitted before. And so one of the first questions is about the election in 2024 and what the Senate may be doing to ensure there's secure voting in the 2024 election.
Well, the most important thing we did was last year stopping Chuck Schumer from federalizing election law. I know we've got people from all 50 states probably here, and maybe the territories too. So we have different election systems. I'm pretty fond of our election system in Arkansas. I think our Secretary of State and now most of our counties do a good job. The fact that our election system is decentralized, that it's really over 3,000 different kinds of election systems, is a good thing because it's not centralized in the power of one set of hands, one office or agency, as it would be if the Democrats had control. That's not just bad because of the kind of laws they would impose upon places like Arkansas, where we don't do ballot harvesting, we don't do ballot drop box, we don't do 2 months of no excuse early and absentee voting. But it's also good because it means there's not a single place where bad actors can go and try to tamper with the results or interfere with voting. Now, again, I'm pretty fond of the system that we have in Arkansas. There's not much I would change about it. I suspect many of you feel the same about your state. I also suspect many of you don't feel the same way about the state. But the most important thing we can do is play within the rules we have, make sure the Democrats aren't breaking the rules beyond what your state says, and win these elections. Win the White House, win the United States Senate and House, and don't forget, if you've got an election in your state, winning your governor's race, winning your legislative races. So if you don't like the election laws you have in your state, you have a chance to change them after you win those elections.
Thank you so much. You spoke a little bit about the border crisis that's happening right now at our southern border, and many of the people that are coming are from other countries. Can you talk a little bit more in specifics about the border bill that recently was passed in the Senate, some of the discussions that are happening on the news this morning about, whether or not that's a win for the Democrats and whether or not that's a win for our country? And then, maybe a little bit more into some of the national security problems, especially given your committee assignments due to the number of folks that are coming from other nations.
Well, so first, Amber, as you said, and as I referred to in my opening remarks, the people are coming here for jobs. I understand that. We've got a great country. People should want to come work here. But they have to come the right way. They have to come legally. And most of the people at our southern border are simply here because they think they can get into the country and then they can get to work. I was at the border, towards the beginning of the Biden administration, and it was already a disaster. It was probably later in the year than now, maybe March or April, still early enough in the year that it was chilly at night. So it's a tragic scene. Under a bridge, you had hundreds and hundreds of migrants, huddled underneath space blankets, or if they had a heavy coat, many children, all just waiting to be processed right in. I found a Border Patrol agent who was willing to kind of break away from the other group of senators with me and walk over and speak to some of these migrants. And I asked a lot of them. Some of them didn't speak English, many of them, for Spanish-speaking countries in Latin America, but plenty others from, like I said, other countries in Europe and Africa and Asia who spoke some broken English. And almost to a person, they did not say, I'm coming here because, I'm being persecuted for being a Christian, or my political party in my home country is suffering violence and imprisonment, or I'm a woman and I'm being singled out because of my stance on rights for women in my home country, all of which are traditionally grounds in which you can be admitted to the United States as a refugee or with a valid asylum claim. Almost every one of them said something like, a job, I can get in, or most simply, Joe Biden. Again, that's the signaling effort I'm talking about. So you mentioned the legislation that is under consideration in the Senate. Maybe it's premature to say it's under consideration. I should take it back, because it hasn't actually been introduced or unveiled yet. So I can't say exactly what will be in it. We've been briefed on occasion about general contours, but immigration is a very complicated and very complex area of law. What I'm looking for is something that will stop the crisis at the border. I don't want to pass a law just for passing a law's sake. Nor am I really thinking about, well, what can we do that might empower a future Republican president, either next January or 10 years from now, to close the border? Because we really don't need to do that. President Trump was able to close the border with the existing laws we have. The challenge we have is trying to force a stubborn and reluctant president to close the border when he doesn't want to. So it can't be a proposal that will give Joe Biden more discretion or leeway, or certainly give him no strings attached money, because we've seen what he'll do. He will simply use it to facilitate the processing of migrants into this country and paying off Democratic cities like Chicago and New York, who have been complaining for months now since Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, started shipping migrants to their cities to see so they could see what it's like. So if it solves a problem, I'm open to the legislation. If it doesn't solve the problem, and certainly if it would do anything to make the problem worse, then I can't support that legislation.
Great. Thank you so much, Senator. The next question that I had was that was submitted previously was, what can be done to counter the messaging in the media and the left's control of the media over some of the present social norms? And how can we as Republicans share our message better about what we are doing as Republicans for the American people?
We got to have more Federation of Republican Women Zoom events. So in one way, obviously the media is biased, and everybody knows the media is biased. Oftentimes they don't even try to hide it anymore. If you recall a few years back, then I published a story in the New York Times about the Black Lives Matter riots in the summer of 2020, and it caused a huge meltdown, and the editor got fired over it. There's no lack of evidence the media is biased, so we can all concede that. But at the same time, we are in a way fortunate that we live in the era we do, because we have so many more means of combating that bias and refuting the liberal point of view. If you put yourself, for instance, in Ronald Reagan's shoes, all he had was the three major news networks and their evening broadcasts, which was picked up straight from the New York Times that morning, and three liberal magazines, Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News. There was really no talk radio to speak of. This was before Rush Limbaugh had popularized the medium in such dramatic fashion. There was no internet. Magazines like the National Review had very limited circulations. Certainly there's no social media where conservatives could go back and actively rebut it. So no question, the traditional legacy media is still extremely biased and really less and less tries to hide it. But we have so many more avenues of rebutting their falsehoods. I think the simplest thing we should do is actively use those avenues to rebut them. That's why I, on occasion, even though I never watch it, will go on CNN. I will go on a Sunday morning talk show on networks. And I certainly use my social media tools in addition to the traditional tools of a senator, like speaking out on the Senate floor or questioning witnesses, especially hostile Biden administration witnesses in committees. I would encourage all of you to do the exact same thing. You may not have those traditional tools in the Senate, but you all have social media accounts if you want to use them. Fortunately, social media censorship of conservatives is becoming exposed. We're having a hearing on it with some of the executives later this week in the Senate Judiciary Committee. So take heart. There's always an opportunity in your own communities, in your states, even in our nation, for active, engaged citizens to help shape the opinions of our fellow citizens. And of course, that also starts not just on social media, but in your workplaces, in your churches, in your kids' PTAs, at their soccer and football and baseball games, in your neighborhoods. Especially for those of you, I'm pleading with you here. If you're not like Julie and me in Arkansas, if you're not like Amber in South Dakota, if you're in a state like Georgia or Nevada or Arizona or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania that really will make the difference this year for the White House, maybe for control of the Senate, never underestimate the single most powerful political advertisement you can give, which is to say to a trusted friend or neighbor or coworker, I'm for this person, here's why, and I hope you will be too. We all work very hard to raise a lot of money for our candidates so they can use that money to reach voters on TV and radio and online. But trust me, that one-on-one direct persuasion, especially if you're living in a state where the presidential race and a Senate race is going to be decided in all likelihood by maybe just a few thousand votes, you truly can make a difference.
You mentioned shortly just now some of the hearings that you're having on, exposing some of these social medias for the moderating that they're doing. You're a lawyer. I'm a soon-to-be lawyer. Can you explain what Section 230 is, what some of these hearings are about, and what the Senate is potentially working on to protect free speech on the internet?
Well, I have to correct you first, Amber. I'm a recovering lawyer, and I've been clean for almost 20 years now, and there's still time for you. There's still time for you to bail out. Just make sure you have a parachute. But yeah, I'm happy to talk about Section 230. Section 230 is a law that gives, in effect, social media companies immunity from anything posted on their site. So if it's very hard to libel or slander a public figure like me under misguided Supreme Court precedent, it's not as hard to libel or slander private citizens. But social media companies have blanket immunity from such matters. And that's because in the infancy of the internet, Congress passed the Telecommunications Act, and it had this section in it, Section 230, which wanted to protect all these small infant companies from the kind of ruinous legal liability they could face if, you know, your neighbor went online and started saying slanderous things about you, and you could turn around and sue not only them, but also sue what would become companies like Facebook or X or Snapchat or what have you. And you could say there might have been merit for that in the mid 1990s when the internet really was in its infancy, and we wanted to make sure that America, not only for economic but for security reasons, had the dominant position in the world, set the standards for the way the internet developed. There's an argument to be made that maybe that was right in the 1990s. I don't think that's the case anymore. These are some of the most powerful companies, not just in the world, but in the history of the world. Sure, there have been powerful companies in the history of America, like Standard Oil or U.S. Steel or what have you, but those companies controlled a single commodity or product in our economy. Companies like Apple and Google and Microsoft and Facebook, they control the flow of information to citizens in a representative democracy. The very lifeblood of self-government. That's why I say they are some of the most powerful companies in the history of the world. And I don't think they should continue to have this extraordinary immunity. Now, later this week, we're having that hearing I mentioned. It's about one specific atrocious use of social media, which is child sexual exploitation. But because we have the CEOs of all these major companies in, I suspect that it will range far and wide, and it will certainly touch on Section 230 and whether companies should be totally immune from lawsuit, as well as other questionable activities like the censorship of conservatives on social media as far back as the 2020 election. So that's Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. You might want to tune in and get your popcorn ready.
Well, thank you, Senator, for speaking on that issue. I wanted to apologize. I have a faux pas. I mentioned that there was a chat earlier where you could submit questions. There is not a chat. So if you want to submit a question, Lori is monitoring the email where you got the emails about this call. There's a link in that email that you can submit questions to. So I apologize. There isn't a chat operating, but you can submit questions via email. One of the next questions was, how can we unite the GOP as fellow Republicans? There's been a lot of divisiveness in our nation, especially amongst the right. You know, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, first, it's utterly necessary if we want to win this fall. If we want to elect a Republican president, we want to win the Senate, we want to hold on to the House, and in some of your states, win very vital gubernatorial or legislative races as well. I understand that we're in primary season now, and that's not just for the presidency with Donald Trump and Nikki Haley. So all of you know, maybe you know this, I endorsed Donald Trump about a month ago. I think the writing is on the wall. President Trump is going to win. Again, it's early, but if you just look at the voting patterns, I think it's clear that he's going to have a smashing victory in South Carolina and certainly states beyond South Carolina like my own. And that it's time to focus our attention as a party at the presidential level on where it belongs, which is the disaster of Joe Biden's presidency. As I said, he makes Jimmy Carter look like Ronald Reagan. But I also understand that you all have your own primaries in your own states. There's a primary for Senate race, there's a primary for a House race, a primary for a gubernatorial race, and that's fine. That's healthy competition in our party. I mean, we're very happy in Arkansas that we have a lot of people that want to run as Republicans, because as some of my fellow Arkansans on the call could tell you, 10 or 12 years ago, you might have to plead with someone to run as a Republican for a local coroner. And now, every time there's a new office open, you got half a dozen or more Republicans running. So it's a great thing. But when the primary is over, whoever wins, it's just always important to remember that, as Ronald Reagan said, my 80% ally is not my 20% enemy. That's true not just in the United States Senate. It's true in our states. It's true in our county committees. We need to make sure that our voters, who are ultimately the lifeblood of our party, once they have their say, that we rally behind their candidates and we make sure that we're winning that election. And again, we'll do everything I can to make sure that's the case at the presidential election and some of these Senate primaries as well. And I just urge you all to do the same thing in your states too. You have differences in primaries. Sometimes they get personal. The key thing is recognizing that the Democrats are the real problem. And that's certainly true in Washington, the United States Senate. I suspect it's true in most of your states as well.
Okay, you just mentioned that you have endorsed Donald Trump, and we had a question come in actually on the topic of Ukraine. And I may be misunderstanding the question here, but I guess you wrote an article a while back talking about how Donald Trump could potentially solve the conflict in Ukraine in 24 hours. I don't know if that was your quote exactly. But the question is, where do you see potentially a 4-year presidency with Donald Trump? How could the conflict in Ukraine be solved? And maybe just talk a little bit about Ukraine in general and what your thoughts are on that.
Well, first off, let me just point out that Vladimir Putin only seems to invade Ukraine when Democrats are president. He did it in 2014 when Barack Obama was president, and he did it in 2021 when Joe Biden's president. He didn't do it for 4 years when Donald Trump was president, even though the Democrats screamed and hollered, Russia, 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 for 4 years. Why did that invasion happen in 2014 and 2021, but not while Donald Trump was president? And it's very simple. Vladimir Putin was scared of Donald Trump and what he might do, or he certainly respected American power, and Trump's willing to use it enough that he was not willing to do what he's always wanted to do, going back 25 years, which is reassemble the old Russian Empire, of which Ukraine is the most important missing piece. I mean, I've talked to the president about this. And I've said to him, and he still does this today. I saw him do it today. He talks about what would not have happened on his watch, or what wouldn't happen on his watch in the future. And I tell him, Mr. President, you don't have to say what would not happen. You can say what did not happen. These things did not happen when you were president. Not just about foreign policy. I mean, we didn't have runaway inflation when he was president either. But Ukraine was not invaded when Donald Trump was president because Vladimir Putin was scared about how Donald Trump responded. Iran didn't unleash all of its terror proxies, certainly after President Trump ordered the killing of Qasem Soleimani, because they were scared of what might happen. So I don't know exactly what President Trump has in mind when he talks about ending the war in 24 hours. Maybe a metaphor for ending it very quickly. And I wish this war had ended a long time ago. I wish it hadn't started at all. The reason it started again is because of Joe Biden's weakness. A year's worth of concessions and appeasement to Russia. And it's not surprising that Russia started massing troops on Ukraine's border just a few weeks after the debacle and humiliation of the fall of Kabul in Afghanistan. But I'll just point you to one of the things the President Trump said many months ago. I think it was on Maria Bartiromo's show, and she asked him this question: well, what do you mean that you'd end the war in 24 hours? And he said, I'd call Putin and tell him that the war is over and he has to stop the aggression. And she said, well, what if he doesn't stop the aggression? He said, I would send Ukraine so many weapons he wouldn't know what hit him. I'd send him weapons that he didn't know that we had, so they could use them against him. But then he said, but if the Russian aggression stops, the war can stop. And that's right. I mean, if Russia lays down its arms, there will be peace. If Ukraine lays down its arms, there will be no Ukraine. And I think President Trump recognized that for 4 years, and that's why we had peace for 4 years.
Thank you for that. So we're going to do one question not on the border, and then the rest of the questions that I have so far are on the border. So very border heavy with curiosity, and I think that's telling with what's going on. But this question is going back to your recovering lawyer history here. What do you think about the Keep 9 amendment trying to stop court packing? Are you on board?
I wish it wasn't an issue, but it is. I mean, you have Adam Schiff in California explicitly running a campaign on court packing. If I thought that we could get the votes necessary to get this through the United States Congress, I think it would be a healthy thing to send to the states. Again, this is not an issue that's ever really come up as a true controversy in American history. It is the case that the size of our Supreme Court is set by statute, not in the Constitution, surprising to some people. And it has changed over time. It's changed in part to reflect the growing size of America and communications and transportation technology in the 19th century before we got to 50 states and kind of cold halt. But the fact that the Democrats now want to eliminate the filibuster in the Senate specifically to pack the court and do things like make Washington, D.C. a state so they can get 2 Democratic senators in perpetuity and federalize our election law, I think it's time that we do consider setting as a constitutional matter the fact that we have a certain number of justices and we cannot accept a single party breaking the rules of our Congress to pack our courts. That is something that happens in third world banana republics. And where would it end as well? Once one party does it, another party would do it. It's not just an assault on the Supreme Court and its integrity, it's an assault on the rule of law itself.
Great. Well, can you explain, this is back to the border, the constitutional discussion about Texas protecting their border, what this means, what the, level of
Sure.
scrutiny we need to do because of it being a constitutional question, what's the actual perspective from the law? And then the other side question involved in this is, what is potentially, if any, current legislation or legislative proposals that you've heard to solve the border crisis that you would be supportive of?
So the media, not surprisingly, has grossly distorted what happened at the Supreme Court last week. In a lower court, the federal government was trying to take action to force Texas to allow it to come in and remove the barriers that Texas has put up in certain places. And the lower court enjoined the federal government. That is, it prohibited the federal government from taking certain actions. The Supreme Court lifted that injunction. So that means it eliminated the restriction on the federal government. It said nothing about what Texas could or could not do. It was silent on that question. So the overheated rhetoric you hear from Democrats and on MSNBC about Texas violating a court order or disregarding the Supreme Court is totally false. And stepping back to the broader question about what states could do, of course, states have a right to protect themselves from foreign invasion. And that's what we're seeing at our southern border is a de facto slow motion invasion. Just put yourself in the shoes of one of the original 13 states ratifying the Constitution in the late 18th century, or for that matter, put yourself in the state of Texas when it was an independent republic before it became a state. If you told the voters who voted in those states to ratify the Constitution or to join the Union that, oh yeah, this means that if there's an invasion of your borders and the federal government does nothing, you can't protect yourself. Does anybody think they would have actually ratified the Constitution? They would have actually joined our union? Of course not. So what needs to happen is President Biden needs to reverse his disastrous border policies and take actions immediately, as I said earlier, to signal to the world the border is closed. But at a minimum, he shouldn't be taking money and resources and manpower away from trying to do their job on the border and stopping Texas from filling in the gap of the job that he won't do. I mean, it just goes to show how ideologically invested the Democratic Party is in their open borders position.
Great. Well, I want to say thank you so much for giving us so much of your time. You've been so gracious to give us so much of your time. And I wanted to also give